Well, Susan Wisely, welcome.
Thank you, Mitch.
Now, we're talking about the Indiana Youth Institute, and let's just go back a little bit. What was the status of youth work in Indiana 25 years ago?
Well, when I reflect back 25 years ago, I think there were several factors that led to the Lilly Endowment being interested in an institution, a statewide institution that was really devoted to the healthy development of young people. The first thing was that our political, business, and academic leaders had a real concern about the economic development of the state of Indiana and Indiana's competitiveness. And they realized that in many ways that our youth were really the seed corn on which our future depended. So they were concerned that not all of our young people had the kinds of opportunities that they needed to fulfill their best potential and to contribute to the state. So that was one thing, a concern about competitiveness and a concern about whether youth were having the opportunities they needed. The second thing was that there was, out of this grew a commitment for Indiana to be known as a state that really cares about its kids. And we wanted not only to have that as part of our reputation, but we wanted to live up to that reputation as well. Now, the Lilly Endowment had a major commitment to the importance of youth workers. We really saw voluntary youth organizations and the adults that staffed those organizations as very key elements in the healthy development of young people. So the neighborhood workers, the teachers, the youth ministers and other religious leaders, the juvenile court workers, those were our front line in helping young people, and we wanted to find ways to assist them because we knew that they really faced an uphill battle. They didn't have access to good information about young people. They didn't have the resources or the capability to conduct that kind of research on their own. They felt fairly isolated and alone in this work. So they needed forums or ways to convene so they could share information with each other about programs that were working, about the frustrations, the hopes, the disappointments in this difficult work. So they needed that kind of supportive community. So those were really the factors 25 years ago that led to this commitment. So the worry about competitiveness of the state, seeing youth as the state's seed corn, a commitment to being known as a state that really cares about its kids, and our sense that youth workers play a key role in that.
Now, you've talked about the youth, but just to ask this question because you have answered it, but I'll ask it anyway. But why was a statewide institute focusing on healthy youth development? Why was that needed?
Why was a statewide institute needed? Well, this takes us into the role of what's often called an intermediary organization. We've talked about how important youth workers are to nurturing youth, but then the question is who helps and nurtures those youth workers, and who gives assistance to those voluntary youth organizations that serve youth. So you're stepping back a level and you're saying there are things that individual youth workers can't do, that they don't have the energy or the capacity to do, and youth organizations need help. So a statewide organization can do the things that an individual organization or youth worker cannot. They can conduct research. They can gather together reliable information about programs that work, exemplary programs. They can convene youth workers to to share information, to really learn how to support each other and collaborate across organizational lines. And they can build that kind of supportive community that encourages youth workers and gives them the motivation to keep on in this difficult work. So that's the reason for an intermediary organization. And the other, I think a lot of funders and a lot of organizations, they focus on healthy youth development and and they're concerned about that. But this was the role of the Youth Institute was to focus on the youth workers and the health of the youth serving organizations.
So there was the formation of the Indiana Youth Institute. What resources were available that prompted the formation of the Indiana Youth Institute?
Here, I would say that one of the major resources was the past experience of the Lilly Endowment in this area. We had funded a number of successful efforts that really gave us a sense of how to move into the future here. But for me, the earlier history that leads to the Indiana Youth Institute really, in my mind, goes back to 1974, when the foundation received a modest letter on pink stationery from a board member of the National Campfire Organization. And in that letter, she described a need that Campfire had. So I think that the program starts with the foundation listening carefully to an individual youth organization and then trying to determine what was the best response to the need they described. So what Campfire said was that they were losing members and were concerned about that. And so they needed research about the needs of young women at that time. And that there wasn't research like that. And so then what they wanted to do was to add a member to their national staff that could help gather that information and help them tailor their programs to meet those needs. Well, we were surprised to hear that in 1974 there hadn't been a national study of young women in the country, but so we looked into it and we found out that indeed was the case. There had been studies of youth which were studies only of boys. There were studies of youth that included boys and girls, but they didn't analyze the data by gender, so you couldn't discern what the voices of young women were. So then the question is, how do you best respond to this need that we've now determined exists? And we thought that rather than just providing one staff member to a national organization, that there would be a similar need in the other national organizations that serve young women across the country. So that we thought our best response was to find a very good researcher and then make sure that the information that was gathered was shared by a whole variety of voluntary youth organizations. We made some inquiries and we were led to Dr. Gisela Konopka at the University of Minnesota. She was well respected in the youth field and had done this kind of research, but not on a national scale. And so the Lilly Endowment supported the first national study of young women in the country. And that study included 1,000 in-depth interviews with young women, and it resulted in a book called Young Girls, A Portrait of Adolescence. But again, we knew that just having a book, just having a study isn't sufficient. That information has to get into the hands of youth workers, and we have to engage their energies and creativity in thinking about how best to respond to the needs that we had uncovered in the study. So then the endowment funded an education program, the National Youth Worker Education Program, where the 8 major girl-serving organizations nominated their youth workers to come for training in Minneapolis and then be convened later on, and to understand what had been learned and to work on how they could improve their services. And parallel to that, there was a special focus on Indiana youth workers through a program based at Indiana State University. So we were focusing both on youth workers nationally and in the state. So that then as that 7-year major effort came to an end, we became aware of another group of young people that had been overlooked. And those were 10 to 14-year-olds, the age group that's now called young adolescents. Yeah. And that was at the time when schools were rethinking their program to meet what they were discovering about the developmental needs of that age group. And youth organizations also needed to have insight into how to serve that group more effectively. The most prominent institution conducting research in this area was the Center for Early Adolescence at the University of North Carolina. So the endowment funded their research, funded their pulling together resources about exemplary programs, and also funded training of youth workers through their efforts. And again, there was an Indiana focus, a special Indiana focus, through a partnership with the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, and that was known as the Lilly Endowment Leadership Education Program. There were 52 outstanding youth workers who were trained and who were experienced in educating others. So these people who were teachers and voluntary youth workers and youth ministers, they constituted a kind of core of resource people who could be available to an institute. Because by this time, what we had learned was that there was a need for good research, good reliable information. There was a need for training of youth workers, and there was a need for to build this kind of network of people who could support one another. And instead of doing it through projects, we had determined that it was important to have a more permanent statewide institution that could continue to provide this kind of help statewide. So that's how the previous grant making led into it. Immediately before the Indiana Youth Institute was established, we also funded a feasibility study conducted by the Hudson Institute. And in that effort, 2 researchers crisscrossed the state to get the opinions of business leaders, educators, political leaders about the need for such an institution, how it should focus its efforts, and also to assess their willingness to support such an institution, both financially and some of those organizations statewide were the leaders who appointed members of the board of directors of the Indiana Youth Institute, so that they were tied into those key other institutions. So that's how that's sort of how we got to establishing an Indiana Youth Institute.
You had talked about the Lilly endowments. Well, what had the Lilly endowment's past experience taught you?
Well, that's what that it taught us that that there is a need statewide for good information about the needs of young people. There is need to convene youth workers and train them so that they understand this information and that they're creating their own solutions to the problems that have been uncovered, that there is a need for youth workers to have their own continuing education, to participate in professional development activities that did not take them away from their daily work with young people, and that there was a need to celebrate the accomplishments and the hard work of youth workers, and there was a need to pulled them together so they provided a supportive community for one another. So through this other grant making, and that's what we learned that helped us.
I'm just asking the question,
Yeah.
sort of like rephrasing, but what information that you relied on, and what were some of the groups and people you consulted?
Okay. Well, we consulted the major universities. We consulted business leaders across the state and political leaders. We relied on the advice of these other programs that we had been involved with the University of Minnesota, the University of North Carolina, and the Center for Early Adolescence, the Hudson Institute, and it was, those were our those are the people who really helped us think this through.
So, how has the investment turned out? Is the Indiana Institute accomplishing what was hoped?
Well, I believe that it has. It has. We've talked about what an intermediary organization can do and why it's important. So, what I see now is that with 25 years of experience, the Indiana Youth Institute is indeed providing those services that we originally thought were important. It's achieving what it set out to do. It's providing reliable data. It has a Kids Count in Indiana data book that includes information about the status of youth in every county in Indiana. Through its information services, it has a weekly newsletter electronic newsletter that brings youth workers up to date on current developments, and that's read by over 500 youth workers every week. And it has a wonderful library where they lend materials and where people can learn about programs that have been successful. And it has a very good website, so they're taking advantage of technology and really, helping to collect that kind of information and give it back to people. And it's also has accomplished a great deal in the professional development of youth workers. It conducts regional workshops on topics such as how to promote parental involvement and how to raise funds. It provides reports on fundamental issues that go to youth workers across the state, and it keeps data on the indicators of well-being for the youth in each county, so that information is helpful to young people. So that it has provided this kind of professional development that youth workers need and rarely have time for, or can't, don't want to leave their jobs in order to go back to school. So it has arranged for educational programs that have free continuing education credits on a whole variety of topics, and so that supports youth workers' continued growth. And then the last thing it has done, it has helped develop a supportive youth committee, and it has highlighted the importance of these hardworking youth workers and has raised them up so that the state can better appreciate the contribution that they're making. And that's the conference that has been the annual conference, which this year celebrates 25 years of accomplishment of the Indiana Youth Institute, is a well-deserved celebration because they have accomplished what we hoped and what others in the state had hoped for, and we are proud that they're continuing to do this. And I congratulate the leaders of the Indiana Youth Institute and the hardworking youth workers that have made it possible. And I really feel very glad to have been part of this story. And I just look forward to the Indiana Youth Institute continuing to contribute to our state.
Final question. Now, you had mentioned intermediary organization. Is there value in an intermediary organization that doesn't focus, say, on serving youth in a hands-on type of way?
Yeah, this is an idea that's not as familiar to some people because we think about we and many people are concerned about healthy youth development, but an intermediary organization is an organization that then can serve those or the youth workers and the youth serving organizations that in turn serve young people. So it steps back a level, and just as youth workers nurture young people, it is an organization, a statewide organization that nurtures youth workers and the youth organizations that serve them.
Well, those are the questions. Is there anything that you can think of that you'd like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, well, I just am very proud of the accomplishments of the Indiana Youth Institute, and I think it is still achieving the original goals it set for itself, and I just want to salute the youth workers across the state.